Hello, my name is Joseph Berger. I'm the Dean of the College of Education and Human Development at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And I'm really pleased to have been invited here to share with you some of my experience and expertise and perspectives on how we can conduct work in a variety of national contexts to improve education. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about international context and development, a responsive approach to enhancing education. So our agenda for this professional development session will begin with covering the mission and context of higher education so that we have a clear understanding of what it is we do in higher education and why it is we do it. And then I want to give you a little more specific background about my own international work and some of the experiences that have shaped my perspectives on working across national borders to improve education for all. And that will serve as the basis for introducing what my colleagues and I refer to as the value framework for higher education, a framework that we developed out of 15 years of work in a variety of countries and nations across all of the different continents. And then the bulk of the presentation will be focused on me being able to share with you what I call the responsive scholarship cycle. This is a 6-point cycle that allows us to think about how we can use guiding principles to help us assess assets in any particular national context, and then engage in work that helps us to enhance capacity and produce impact, all the while being engaged in reflective learning so that we can continuously improve ourselves as we strive to help others. So let's begin talking a little bit about the mission of higher education. And I'm sharing with you here the summary of a statement that came out of an international conference hosted by UNESCO in 1998 that really focused on what is the role of higher education in a modern society. And I particularly appreciate this particular definition because it transcends the simpler definition of the mission of higher education to provide teaching, research, and service. And in particular, I like this particular definition because it emphasizes a set of core values and principles that should and do drive our work. So first, higher education has as its primary purpose the responsibility to educate highly qualified graduates who are able to meet the needs of the present and future society. And I really want to emphasize that as we're educating our students, it's not just to meet current needs, but it's also so that they're prepared to contribute to and meet the demands of future society and address challenges that we can't yet possibly know. And I think this is particularly timely and germane to think about, given that there's increasing pressure for higher education to produce graduates who are immediately employable, and where many of the metrics we use to assess the effectiveness of higher education focus far too heavily on first employment and employment in a field of study, when in fact what we really want to do is make sure that we have graduates who are able to be lifelong learners and who can work in a variety of contexts and who can evolve and be responsive to new demands and changes in our rapidly developing global societies. Secondly, higher education provides opportunities for higher learning throughout the life as a contributing citizen in society. So again, here it's important to recognize that developing people who are not only able to master a particular canon of knowledge or set of skills so that they contribute to a particular profession, but also so that they can be contributing citizens and leaders in the communities in which they live, work, and serve. 3, universities and colleges have the responsibility to create and advance knowledge through research and provide relevant expertise to assist cultural, social, and economic development. And I always put these 2 points together. It's clear that we're supposed to conduct research, not just pure research, but also applied research. And it's important that we take the scholarly skills that we use in our research and we apply them to real-world challenges so that our knowledge can directly impact the societies in which we live. 4th, higher education should help us to understand, to interpret, preserve, enhance, and promote national and regional, international, and historic cultures in a context of cultural pluralism and diversity. As we become increasingly globalized, that it's really important to recognize that there are dominant forms of knowledge, dominant cultural norms and perspectives that get transmitted and because of unequal power relations in the world get imposed on other cultures. And so that we should be thinking about not only how do we advance learning, change, cutting-edge technology, new forms of knowledge and inquiry, but also think about how those skills and those conceptual and methodological tools help us to make sure that we protect culture at all levels. And I think it's especially important that we think about how best to facilitate a value of cultural pluralism and diversity so that it is not just the dominant cultures that end up defining what quality is in higher education, what success is in our fields, and what types of contributions we're making as a higher education field. And then, of course, higher education should help and protect and enhance societal values which form the basis of democratic citizenship. Recognizing that the specific forms of the democratic citizenship may vary greatly from country to country and cultural context to cultural context, it is clear that higher education needs to be cultivating future citizens and leaders who embody these values in their work and in their citizenry. Finally, it's important to contribute to the development and the improvement of education at all levels. So higher education has often focused only on educating students as they enter a particular college and university campus. And increasingly, we need to recognize that we have a responsibility in higher education to help improve all pathways into higher education so that we have more students who are ready, willing, and seeking the higher education that we offer. No path to success in modern society is complete without access to high quality, relevant, and affordable higher education. But that's not going to happen if we're not working with our fellow educators in primary and secondary education to make sure that there are multiple pathways of success into and through higher education. On the other side, given that we must ensure that lifelong learning occurs throughout our societies, universities must think about ways, even once our students have graduated, to continue to provide learning opportunities across the life spectrum. So before going any further, I want to talk a little bit about some of the higher education trends, things that I think of as drivers that help shape the ways in which we enact and fulfill the mission of higher education. So higher education is rapidly expanding around the globe. There's not a country in the world right now that isn't seeing the rise of participation of students in higher education, and where the demand outpaces the supply of opportunities for a higher education. Yet, we still are falling far short of the goals that we need to reach in order for higher education to truly make the kind of impact it can in the world. For example, in 2000, only 19% of the college-age population in the world was enrolled in some form of post-secondary education. We've made progress in the last few years. As of 2015, we were up to 28%. So a gain of almost an additional 50% from 19 to 28%. And so that is, on the one hand, admirable progress. And on the other hand, it's a little disheartening to think that higher education, if it really is the ticket to success in adult life, is only reaching just over a quarter of the world's eligible population. And that 28% doesn't represent the percentage of people who are successfully graduating from college. That 28% merely represents people who are getting initial access to college. So there's clearly a great challenge before us, given that the vast majority of young people in the world still do not have access to higher education. Higher education is also increasingly cross-cultural, and it's cross-cultural in several different ways. For example, professors at top research universities have more mobility than ever before to travel across borders, to present their work, to collect data, to collaborate with colleagues. Students attending the better world-class universities around the world have increasing opportunities to be mobile as they go to other countries to study for their degrees or for short-term exchanges. And knowledge knows no boundaries, as the research that's conducted in any one country is almost instantly and readily available upon publication to scholars anywhere else in the world. Yet, this cross-cultural opportunity still remains in the domain of an elite few. It is mostly the wealthier countries and the wealthier individuals and the wealthier institutions in those countries that can take advantage of cross-cultural opportunities. We have much work to do to think about how can we provide everybody an equitable opportunity to learn more about the world and not just learn about what is in their own neighborhood, their own community, their own backyard. Higher education is increasingly costly and competitive. And the cost of higher education operates at two levels. One, it is expensive and increasingly more expensive to operate a college or university. The competition for top talent, not just within the field of higher education, but as universities now have to compete for top PhDs who may have research opportunities in the corporate world or in independent research think tanks, drives up the cost of personnel. And the rapid advent of new technologies that are required for cutting-edge research, that are expected for students to be engaged with the newest forms of pedagogy and the best learning opportunities, and the upgrade of facilities that is needed as we think about how to serve our students, all make higher education a very expensive enterprise. And unfortunately, too much of that cost is being passed on to students and their families. Even as higher education has expanded worldwide, the percentage of government funding to support higher education has been decreasing, which means that universities either have to work harder to find sources of revenue to support their mission, and or they pass those expenses on to their students, making it increasingly hard for students and their families to afford higher education, even as it becomes more important, and it increases the inequity gap in terms of who has access to higher education and who does not. So as we think about these drivers, there's a need to enhance and develop these efforts in authentic and sustainable ways. And so what I mean by this is that there's been a call for us to think about not how do institutions of higher education all follow single models of success, where the elite forms of higher education become the models that other institutions feel like that they must mimic in order to be successful themselves, when in fact they are already disadvantaged because they are so far behind in terms of access to resources, both material and financial resources, as well as symbolic resources such as prestige and reputation. And so how do we think about what are ways to sustain the vast majority of universities in the world that are not necessarily fitting the definition of what the World Bank has called the world-class university? And I think the concept of world-class university is actually a dangerous notion, because very few universities have the resources to conduct the kind of cutting-edge research, to attract the very top talent in terms of faculty, but also to be so exclusive as to have low admissions rates, which is one of the definitions of a world-class university, that actually inhibits access and promotes inequity rather than providing greater opportunities to expand access and opportunity. So what are the other models from which we can learn about how education best practice occurs in universities that are having a very positive impact on the lives of their students in implied research, but without necessarily meeting all of the standards of world-class universities? And that there is a lack of practical research that's being conducted in higher education that directly informs policy and practice. There is an overemphasis on pure research and on traditional academic disciplines without thinking about how that research can be best translated, how we can cross disciplinary boundaries so that the work that we do is more accessible to practitioners and policymakers who can then make the impact of higher education more positive, more sustainable, and more equitable. And finally, I want to focus on the overemphasis on the concept of world-class quality. I just mentioned a moment ago my concerns about the definition of world-class universities. And while I think that quality is not only a very positive construct, it's an absolutely essential foundation for all of higher education, but that we have often looked at quality in very narrow ways that serve the interests of a few and can actually have negative effects on many others. And let me give you an example. That when we define quality of a university partially on having very low acceptance rates of students, what we're doing is we're saying that the only way to be a high-quality university is to reject more people than we accept. And if every university in the world does that, we will actually be able to serve very few individuals. And even if we have the most cutting-edge, highest-quality curriculum in the world, it won't do as much good if individuals aren't benefiting from it. I'm also concerned that we define quality more on inputs. What are the test scores of a student before they even enter college? How many resources are raised by the university? What percentage of faculty before they get hired by the university have PhDs? These are all input indicators, and they say very little about what happens inside the university itself, and it says very little bit about what are the value-added impacts of the university. So I am concerned that we have a very narrow definition of quality that has been defined by the very few traditional elite universities and serves as a mechanism for those institutions to maintain their place atop the hierarchy. So while I think quality is important, I think we have to think about ways to transcend, not replace, the term of quality when thinking about how to judge the positive impact and effectiveness of higher education institutions. So let me talk a little bit as we wrestle with those problems about my international work. I've been very privileged for almost 20 years now to be able to work on projects and partnerships that include all aspects of the mission of higher education, working with other institutions, national governments, faculty colleagues, students, and many others in a wide variety of countries around the world. And I've shown some examples here, from work in Russia to projects in China and Pakistan, Afghanistan, where I've had a series of projects for almost 15 years now, Malawi in East Africa, Colombia, and now I'm here in Brazil as we're embarking on a partnership between my university, UMass Boston, and Tiradentes University. So let me say a little bit more about some of my international work so that you can get a bit of a flavor of the experience that I bring to this topic. And these are just a few of the projects that I've highlighted. These are projects that I've played a major leadership role in, and they include the Malawi University UPIC project, which was a partnership designed to create the first 2 graduate degrees in the field of education in Malawi. So we worked closely with Chancellor College at the University of Malawi and the Malawi Ministry to create a degree in educational leadership and a degree in educational assessment. And this included working with the National Ministry to reform the assessment system used in Malawi so that the leaders and the assessment experts could make sure that the testing procedures that they were teaching about, that they were implementing, and that their graduates would be responsible for were actually serving the needs of students in that country. I also worked in Northwest China on a leadership development project, which was a joint effort with Shanxi Normal University and the Northwest China Educational Research Center to do a needs assessment to identify better ways to train educational leaders for secondary schools and universities throughout a 5-province region. I've been involved in a whole series of projects funded by USAID in Afghanistan, working to rebuild the higher education system after the fall of the Taliban. It began working with 14 teacher training colleges to help them get restarted. It quickly became apparent that if we only worked with those faculties, that all of our work would go for naught. So that led to working with the ministry to develop and support the entire higher education system in the country, which started with the development of a national higher education strategic plan, the development of a quality assurance and accreditation system, many leadership development trainings, many work on improving faculty knowledge and pedagogical skills, and the development of new degree programs, including the first graduate degrees in Afghanistan and the first associate degrees in that country. One example of our many pieces of work in Afghanistan was the development of the first Master of Education program in that country. And that was a particularly significant program because not only was it the first graduate degree, but in the 9 years since we started it, 9 cohorts have now graduated, and half of the graduates have been women, which has promoted gender equity in the country and has more than quadrupled the number of women who are teaching in Afghan universities with graduate degrees. And then there's the Palestine Leadership and Teacher Development Project, which was working with 8 faculties of education in the National Ministry to create a National Institute for Educator Training. And then the Pakistan Community College Leadership Program, which is where we've been working to improve the managerial capacity of leaders of new community colleges that are being created throughout the country of Pakistan. And then finally, most recently, worked with Uno Minuto University and colleagues from the University of Missouri to create a educational research center that focuses on how higher education can contribute to greater equity of educational access throughout Colombian education. This is a wide range of projects that have involved multiple collaborations and that have been tremendous learning opportunities for me, my colleagues, my students, and our partners. I also want to emphasize that we have been able to apply our scholarly tools not only to research, but also to building capacity, to leadership development, to policy development, and to improve teaching and learning in multiple countries. So out of this work, my colleagues and I have been developing a framework to think about how to improve higher education. And we call this the Higher Education Value Framework. And we call this the value framework because we want to transcend traditional definitions of quality in higher education. And instead we want to focus on value. And we do so thinking about it in two regards. One, value as something that has merit or worth so that we can better demonstrate what is the value of higher education to individuals, to communities, and to societies. And then what are the values that drive the enterprise of higher education? What is the mission-driven value orientation that guides all of our work? And this framework starts with the drivers, which is the context that I was discussing previously in terms of what are the different trends that are driving higher education. Those exist within a larger socio-cultural context, which itself then has an embedded policy environment in which national systems create a series of formal and informal policies that guide how higher education develops, how it is run, and how it provides opportunity for people in that country. And then within that, there are a number of academic units, colleges, universities, institutes, faculties, which then house numerous individuals. And the individuals are at the heart of this model because, and it's also, you'll notice the biggest circle there in the middle in terms of emphasis, because it is the individual that higher education is designed to serve. Each individual student is a unique learner, but each individual faculty member, each individual administrative leader is making choices that impact the ways in which we both take advantage of higher education and provide advantages for others. And around that are four key points: quality, access, relevance, and investment. So let's start with quality. So quality is the merit and the rigor and the excellence associated with the curricula that we use, with the methods we use for instruction, with the methods we use for research, with the facilities we provide our students, and with the ways in which we package educational opportunity. Our goal is to have every higher education program in the world to be of the highest quality, to be using best practices, and to be continuously learning and developing how best to meet our many responsibilities. But quality alone isn't enough. It's also balanced by the need for relevance. And relevance is the extent to which higher education has the ability to be responsive to real-world needs, the practical needs of community development, of ensuring peace and stability, of citizenship, and the building of civil societies, economic development, and workforce development. Many people will say you can't have quality without relevance, but I like to make sure that we address both concepts at the same time, because otherwise we often forget about relevance in the pursuit of quality that's often measured by things like prestige, or maybe best practices that work in one national context but not another. And I'll give you an example to illustrate the difference. When we were working in Afghanistan, we were asked to help the Kabul Medical University to improve their performance. One of the very first things we asked them was about their curriculum. Well, they were very proud of their curriculum, and they said, we have a world-class, high-quality curriculum because the Japanese government gave us some technical assistance, and we have the very same curriculum that's used in Japan, which is one of the best university systems in the world and has some of the best medical schools in the world. So we know it's a very high-quality curriculum. Yet, that curriculum included things like neurosurgery, of which there are no facilities in Afghanistan, probably will not be in my lifetime, in which neurosurgery can be performed. At the same time, the curriculum didn't include things like the basic health service package or the essential health service package, which is what is used to teach doctors how to practice medicine when there are limited or no medical facilities at all. And so it was a very high quality curriculum, but it was not very relevant. So we need both. So now I'd like to talk about access. And I want to talk about access in two ways. First, to talk about access in terms of students and their ability to have the opportunity to not only enroll in college, but the opportunity to succeed and graduate from college with a meaningful degree that leads them to future opportunities. And to do so in a way that is equitable. So no matter what your family background is, you have this opportunity. But I also think it's important to talk about access of knowledge, that as we produce knowledge, that knowledge is readily available around the world, that it's not just restricted to expensive journals and to universities that have resources to be able to have the opportunity to immediately obtain the most recent research when it's denied to others because they can't afford it or it's not readily available on the internet and elsewhere. So we have to think about how we promote access of opportunity for teaching, learning, and scholarship throughout the world. And then I want to talk about investment. And I put that down at the bottom because, as I've said before, higher education is an increasingly expensive enterprise, and so we need to think about if we believe in the mission of higher education, how do we make sure that we have the type of investment that we need? How do we cultivate new investors? And how do we make sure that that investment is used responsibly to support higher quality, increased access, and rigorous relevance in the delivery of higher education? Done right, as we put these things together, we will get the kind of output and outcomes and impact that meet our responsibilities in promoting the mission of higher education. All of this takes time. So you'll notice the arrow down at the bottom, that often we don't think strategically about how much time it will take to make the kinds of transformations that are needed in higher education. And so we need to make sure that we come up with plans over time to sustain this kind of work. So using that framework, now I want to talk about how do we move from understanding the macro picture of improving higher education to what are some processes that we can engage in as scholars in order to be more effective in putting the value framework to use. And there are 6 dimensions to what I call the responsive scholarship cycle. We begin with our guiding principles. We follow that with assessing assets. Then we make sure that we are engaging in work that will allow us to be enhancing capacity, which then will produce the kind of impact that we want, all the while making sure that we're reflecting and learning so that we can revise and update our guiding principles, which will then drive improved performance as we go through this cycle again and again. So let's begin by talking about what are some of our guiding principles that we've learned through our work over the years. One, that scholarly engagement is mission-driven. I've already been talking a lot about the importance of our mission and how these values must drive how we use our scholarship to engage with our students, our communities, and our societies. Social justice and equity must be core drivers. We cannot continue to perpetuate higher education that primarily serves an elite few in most societies. That 28% of the world that has access to higher education is far too low. So we must think about how to equitably promote access and opportunity. We need to apply scholarly expertise to real-world challenges. Again, the more practical we can be with our scholarship, with our teaching, with our service, the more positive impact we can make, the better we can fulfill our mission. Learning and development are multi-directional for mutual benefit. So what do I mean by this? It means that as we focus on working with other partners, and if we come from, let's say, a country in the global north, a country or a university that has great resources, and even if we believe we have an obligation to help others, if we view it strictly as a benefactor-beneficiary relationship, it's going to fail. We need to go into all of our work thinking in multiple directions. How can we benefit others, but how can we also benefit from ourselves as well? I'll give you an example. When I was working in Malawi to help develop the graduate programs, I went there to teach them how to teach leadership, and I went there to model teaching a leadership course. And in all of my efforts to teach leadership in the United States, I had used case studies. But I got to Malawi and recognized that there were no case studies that were relevant to that particular context, and I was a little at a loss what to do. But then I realized I had a room full of experts on leadership in Malawi. And so I created a new pedagogy where they created their own case studies using descriptive and analytic questions. Well, that experience allowed me to revise how I taught my leadership classes in the US. So I learned from the Malawians and the Malawi experience how to improve education in the US. It was bi-directional. Motivation matters. And what I mean by this is the reasons we do things matter. So the principles that I've been talking about in this session are very important drivers so that we really think purposefully about what values and principles are driving our work, not just what utilitarian outcomes will result from that work. I also think that it's important to respect and honor local expertise, that I've been very grateful to learn from others in various countries, many of whom wouldn't be recognized as experts at my university in the United States. Many people have not had the opportunity to earn PhDs, for example. Yet I have worked with many people who are just as brilliant as any colleague I have who already has a PhD, but who are also experts in the local context, experts in ways that I can never be, and that I need to learn from if I really want to work in another national context or culture. That we must adapt, not adopt knowledge and best practices when we're bringing them to another country. And what I mean by this is there are many best practices that just get adopted from one place to another, and then we wonder why they fail. They really need to be adapted to the local context. And it's not the person like myself from the outside who should do the adaptation. It's the local expert who really knows that context and who has to live with the consequences of that adaptation. Teaching, research, service, and leadership are inquiry-driven. Often we think of research as being inquiry-driven, but all of our work in higher education must be inquiry-driven so that we can take full advantage of our scholarly tools in improving all of these areas that drive the mission of higher education. We must implement our work at multiple levels: the macro level, the policy environment; the meso level, the organizational context, such as colleges and universities and academic units; and the micro level, with each individual that we work with. And in doing so, we must embrace trade-offs. And what I mean by this is that for most of the challenges we're dealing with, there's no one right answer. We should be spending our time, our energy, our talent, our expertise on those challenges that are so significant that there aren't easy answers. If there were, they would already be solved. So we need to recognize that we can live with trade-offs, and that it's not about coming up with the only right solution, but it's being purposeful about which trade-offs we can live with and which ones we can't. And finally, I want to say that sustainability is essential. Whatever new initiatives, programs, and projects we launch, we have to make sure they're sustainable. And this is partly goes back to social justice being a core value, because we have to think about how to steward our many forms of resources so that not only people can benefit right now from our good work, but they can continue to benefit in the future. So now let's move on to how we go about assessing assets. And when I talk about assessing assets, I want to focus on constructive and positive definitions of what we're looking at when we're first studying how to enter a situation and how to come up with a plan to improve a challenge in a particular context. Many people talk about needs assessments. My concern with needs assessments is those are often built on a deficit model, that we're looking at what people don't have. We're looking at gaps and deficiencies, and I prefer to focus on assets. What are the advantages and the resources that exist in every community and society in the world? And so there's really three purposes. First, there's the technical purpose, and this, I think, is what most people think about. And, when we're assessing assets, from a technical perspective, we're looking at the rigorous collection and analysis of empirical data that informs our research questions that guide the work. And all of our work should have guiding research questions as scholars. Even if we're thinking about developing an academic program, we need to think about what is it that our students need to learn. How are we going to know that they're learning that? How are we going to know whether the learning objectives have been met at the end of the course? So we can apply our scholarly skills even to things like teaching and learning. Secondly, from a cultural perspective, we have to think about being intentional in our effort to be immersed in and engaged with a local culture in order to better understand each unique context. So in assessing assets, we have to be careful not to put our norms, values, and conceptual frameworks into a situation that's very different from ours and impose a particular set of cultural principles on somebody else. So we need to make sure that we're assessing assets from a cultural perspective and not just a technical perspective. And then third, there's the relational approach, which is the identification and building of personal relationships across cultures that serve as the foundation for future work. So organizational agreements and contracts are necessary, but they are not sufficient for the success of sustainable improvement in cross-cultural projects. Strong personal working relationships are essential for success. And I don't think we can take the relational for granted, because it's hard enough to figure out how to work in challenging projects with people that already share certain cultural norms and perspectives with us. It's even harder when we're separated both geographically and culturally. So we have to be very intentional about how we assess what our relational assets are in a particular situation. So from a technical perspective, the types of questions that we ask are really driven by looking at what are the perceptions that the people involved in the endeavor hold, what are the challenges that we're meeting, what are the values that come into play, what are the resources available, and then what are the priorities. And so it's all of these 5 different concepts that we need to be thinking about as we come up with technical solutions to driving how we're going to approach our work. And then there's the cultural assessment. And from from a cultural perspective, we really need to think about the different layers of culture. And so as we think of what's been called the onion model of culture, that what's most immediately and easily observable in a culture are artifacts. So things like signs, things like symbols and logos and mission statements. So things that have been produced by humans to represent the values of the organization. But those are usually the easiest thing to observe. You can observe them by quickly going into any context, but they're usually the lowest common denominator or the less deeply held representation of what people truly value. If we spend more time in a particular culture, then we can start to see what are the norms and what are the espoused values. The espoused values are what people say is important, but the norms are the patterns of behavior that we can observe over time that may or may not match what people say. So again, it takes longer for us to be able to determine what are behavioral norms than what are espoused values. And then finally, there are the core values. And the only way we can truly learn about core values is to spend enough time and to triangulate what we observe about norms, espoused values, and artifacts to see what are the consistent messages across those other layers of culture. And then finally, in assessing relational assets, we need to think about a number of different components as we look for who will be good relational partners to work with. So for example, what kind of expertise do they bring? How do we define and recognize that expertise? Do the individuals have integrity? Well, they do what they say and well, they honor their word. What are the values that they hold within their own culture, and which of those values align with the mission of higher education? What is their positionality? To what extent can they impact and affect the kind of work that we need to do together? And finally, what kind of attitude and aptitude do they bring to the effort? I'm always looking for people who are positive and constructive, and whether I'm choosing partners to work with on an international project, or I'm agreeing to with others to work on that, or I'm hiring somebody to work with me in my own university, the thing that's most important to me is, do people bring a positive and constructive attitude and aptitude to the work? So as we start to engage the work and we've completed assessing our assets, I think it's always important to have a clear theory of change. Once we've assessed the assets, then we know what kind of inputs, what kinds of resources, capabilities, and expertise we bring to the challenge. Those inputs then help us define what's possible in the way of activities. And then those activities, we need to be clear what kinds of outputs, what kinds of products are the direct result of those activities, which then will lead to outcomes that affect the individuals that we're trying to target in the intervention, and then ultimately what is the larger impact in communities and societies. So as we think about then how to engage in the work, I think it's also important to be purposeful and conscious about it as we engage in certain activities. What level are we looking at? And I've created this chart to give us an example of how across our different projects we've thought about working at different levels depending on the particular activity. So there are some activities that might start at the micro level where we're doing individual capacity development. There are others that might start at the meso level because we're doing organizational development, and still others that start and focus on the policy level. But even when we start in one place, and even if we're focusing on one level or another, we always make sure to pay attention to the other levels. And let me give you some examples. So for example, in the first column, I'm talking about faculty professional development. We've done a lot of professional development, teaching faculty members how to have better active learning, pedagogical skills in the classroom. And we always start with the individual, building individual skills. But if you train a lot of faculty members and then you put them back in faculties or colleges and universities where nobody else understands what they've learned, you're setting them up to be outliers, and it's likely that they won't be able to sustain the good work that they've been taught to do. And then from there, then you need to make sure that the policy environment supports things like active learning and that it rewards those faculty members for doing innovative work rather than punishes them because nobody recognizes the new techniques as something of value in that particular context. Another example, in the middle column, the graduate education program. We've helped develop many graduate education programs around the world, and that always requires that we start thinking about the organizational context. What is the structure of the program? Where is it going to be housed in the university? But as soon as we are making those decisions, we need to start developing the individual capacity of the faculty members so they have the capacity to be able to deliver that graduate program. And we have to work with the policy context to make sure that that graduate program will be recognized and supported in that particular country or setting. And then in the third column, we worked on the development of the first quality assurance system in Afghanistan. So that was a policy level intervention where we needed to start at the policy level because until we defined what a quality assurance system was and what the policies were that were guided it, nobody understood what it is that they were supposed to do. Once we had defined the policy, then we could start working with the universities so that they had quality assurance committees in place, and then we could be working on doing individual capacity development to train the faculty members and leaders so that they could implement the quality assurance system. So in each case, we started at a different level of implementation, but then we moved to make sure that we were paying attention to what were the effects and the impacts in the other levels. We often find, just as a tool to show you that in engaging this work, that it's essential to have a Gantt chart, because as I said before, it's important as we're going to make these kind of positive impacts to be able to plan over time. And so we may have multiple objectives for a project. Each of those objectives may have multiple activities, but we need to make sure who's responsible for accomplishing those objectives, for running those activities, what are the indicators or deliverables that are going to tell us that we've been a success, and then we might have multiple years. I'm just showing year one here, but then for each quarter or each month, how do we make sure that we're making progress towards each of those objectives and each of those activities? So Gantt charts provide a very good map for large, complex projects that must be sustained over time. So as we engage in that work, we really have to think about how we're enhancing capacity. And the types of ways that we might enhance capacity vary depending on what level of work that we're engaged in. So at the macro level, we might look at things like developing policy, conducting policy analysis, creating national strategic plans, creating national centers or national assessments or assessment systems. At the meso level, we're focused on organizational development, which could include institutional strategic plans, faculty development centers, new academic programs, new curricula, and perhaps even public-private partnership to support those programs. And then finally, at the micro level, we would be focusing on things like individual faculty development to improve research skills, to improve pedagogy, to improve classroom assessment. We might be looking at leadership development so that we can have better administrative and academic leaders at the institutional or system level. And we'd be looking at student development. How do we have impact on individual students? The important thing is regardless of what level you're working at, is to be as intentional and purposeful as possible to enhance the capacity through those efforts at the appropriate level, with the work at that level being in the foreground, but recognizing, as I noted a moment ago, that the work done at the other levels needs to come later or be actively engaged upon in the background. So if we want to really produce impact, then we have to think about what kind of research we do. And this chart is an adaptation from some work that has been done on the relationship between pure basic social science research on the left and purely applied research and development on the right. In the middle is what I call responsive research. And whereas pure basic research is driven by existing theoretical understandings, applied research and development is driven by existing policy and practice. And so when we put those together, we have existing learning, both what we already know and what we're teaching others to learn and to be able to do. So as those starting points then, those drive the kind of research that we can do. And once we start with existing learning that is driven by both basic and applied research, we can start looking at ways to be responsive to individual, community, and societal needs. So for example, we may want to be responsive to, for example, a low literacy rate. And we don't want to be reactive in that we only do what others have already indicated is the problem. We don't want to take their word for it. We don't want to be proactive and assume that we already know the answer. So we want to be what I call responsive, to use our scholarly tools, some of which I've been sharing with you, to responsively engage with key stakeholders and constituents so that then we can focus on improving learning. And where we take the improved basic understandings that we get from basic social research and the improved policy and practice that comes from applied research, and we put those together with our own research to make sure that we have our continuously improving learning. And I think it's important to emphasize here that this is an iterative process whereby we are always using multiple forms of research to improve real-world situations. And so what we want to do is make sure that we're not merely replicating the work of others. We may be using the work of others, but that we're using the conceptual and the methodological tools from multiple disciplines and fields so that they inform real-world challenges. And if we're really going to produce the kind of impact we want, then leadership's very important. And for me, leadership's not just something that is in the domain of somebody who has a title or who has an administrative position such as the president of a university or the dean of a college. To me, leadership is something that all of us in higher education, whether we're scholarly experts, faculty members in our classroom, or academic leaders such as a dean or administrative leader such as a chancellor or vice chancellor, that we're all viewing our work as the work of leadership. And the definition I use here of leadership comes from an adaptation of the work done by Joseph Roust, who was one of the most eminent scholars of leadership in the United States. And in this definition of leadership, we look at it as an influence relationship among leaders and followers who pursue continuous change-oriented improvement that builds upon their mutually socially just values and shared achievements. So it's important to recognize that leadership is an influence relationship. It's not about power, it's not about control. It's how do we engage in meaningful relationships that allow us to positively influence others. That it must be about the continuous change and improvement, and that it's something that involves our core values, values of social justice, values of the mission of higher education, and that they must be shared achievements. So it's not about the achievement we obtain solely as the leader, but the shared achievements of the folks that we are working with closely in these endeavors and that we are serving through higher education. And so then finally, we need to think about reflecting learning, so that as we go through this work, we're constantly reflecting on what we're learning and what others are learning, so that we don't have to wait for a project to be over for us to be able to improve it. So we must engage in ongoing formative assessment. We must use constant member checking where we work with the participants to make sure that they're benefiting and understanding from our interventions the way we believe they are. It involves sustained dialogue with colleagues. We must constantly monitor those trade-offs I spoke of earlier. We must be very dynamic about adapting our ideas. It's not just about adapting ideas at the beginning of a project as we bring a best practice from one cultural context into another, but it's also, even once we start the project, monitoring and reflecting so that we may need to adapt as we go along and be nimble and flexible so that as things don't go as we anticipate, or if the trade-offs change, that we can still make sure that we're making progress towards the kind of outputs, outcomes, and impact that we want to make. And then finally, we need to use multiple formats to represent ideas. And one of the things that I often challenge people to do, particularly when we're working across cultures, is that if something's really important and we want to make sure that others will understand it the same way we do, how can we represent that in multiple formats? For example, can we write a description of it? Can we develop a picture of it? Can we develop a flow chart or a diagram? And if other people can interpret the different ways that we represent that same concept or idea, then we can have more confidence that we'll have fidelity of translation and that we will all be implementing it together with shared meaning. So those are a number of tips and approaches and tools that I've found very helpful in using my scholarly tools, working collaboratively with others to improve the delivery of the mission higher education across cultural contexts. It is very demanding work. This has just been a high-level overview of the different approaches and tools that we use. I find it very challenging and very rewarding, and I look forward to engaging with others as we pursue in the common good of higher education throughout the world together. Thank you very much.